I'm back in the project in our population combined query, and as you saw, we now need to create new tables in the end. I don't want to change this initial population combined query, as these are our initial queries, as we call these here. So in the end, I just want to keep this information as it is and now create two tables. So two dim tables and one fact table. But all these tables should be based on the population combined query, because now in here we have all the information we need. We have country-specific information, so the country ID and a country. And we have age group-specific information, the age group here. And we have population-related information, something like the gender here, or the population count. So in the end, we want to split this table into three separate tables, you could say. And to do that, we kind of have to copy this table. Now, copying tables in Power BI Desktop can be done in two different ways. You can explore these if you either right-click onto the query that you want to copy. Here you can find this duplicate or reference option. Alternatively, you can find this option if you go to the home ribbon and here manage. Here you also have duplicate or reference. You can also delete queries, not what we want to do at this stage. The question though is, what's the difference between a query duplicate and a query reference? Let's get started with the reference here. And we can say that we have three queries as we have it in our project. We created a combined query based on these three initial queries. And in this combined query, we applied some steps. What we can see in this query is that we have the first step, which is the source, so which basically points towards these initial queries. And we have some remove columns and so on. Now, if you would now take this combined query and create a so-called reference, well, this would happen. We would create one reference, so the first reference query, and this query would be connected to our combined query. This means we wouldn't copy the existing query, we would just create a new query which contains all the information from the existing query as it's connected to the source file. That's important. We don't repeat any applied steps. We just have the reference which as a source retrieves the information from the combined query. If you would create a second reference, for example, like this, it would be the same logic. This second reference would again be connected to the combined query. And that's actually the logic that we saw when we used append, if you remember. In our combined query, which basically is built based on the append feature, we have two applied steps here. The first one is the source, and if you click onto this gear wheel symbol, you can see that we have append here. This means the information for the source step is retrieved from our first two population tables. And if you click onto the gear wheel symbol next to appended query, like this, you see that the remaining information is retrieved from the third query. And I showed you this before. If we go back to the sorted row step, if I would try to delete the third query, for example, right here, this doesn't work as this query is referenced by another query. So we used this reference feature already, although you didn't know about it. But back to our slide now, because we also have this one here, the duplicate. For the duplicate, let's think about the same scenario. We have three different queries. We created a combined query. And in this combined query, we have different steps applied. Now we duplicate this combined query and have this first duplicate here. What's happening here now is, in contrast to the reference, we copy this initial query, including all of the applied steps you can see in our combined query. And this means if you then would create another duplicate, well, this duplicate will again be a complete copy of that combined query, so it will be entirely equal to the combined query, a complete standalone query in the end. So this is the difference. A reference depends on the initial query. A duplicate is a complete copy of an existing query. Now, when should you use which one? Well, the more efficient one is the reference query, as you don't have to copy all the applied steps. But if you have plans on changing the combined query, in our case, for example, later, then a duplicate might be the better choice, because you can kind of work in the duplicate on its own as it's a standalone version of the query. If you create a reference and then change the initial combined query, in our case, this can cause problems in the reference queries. Therefore, I recommend to use duplicates if you plan to do changes to the combined query, so to the initial query you use. If you don't want to change this initial query, then a reference would be the way to go. In our case, as we are done with the population combined query here, we will therefore use references. Now, let's create a reference of this combined query. Here in the home ribbon, manage and reference. we got this query now. This can take a few seconds. Let's drag and drop this query into the other queries in the meanwhile. Or let's maybe even create a group for these queries, because this will be the final data model. Therefore, to make this really clear, I would like to create a new group and call it data model, like this. And here we can now put our population combined query into. And let's also rename this query here to, let's say, dim minus region, because we will get started with our first dimension table here. One important thing, we created the reference here. As you can see, the applied steps, or the only applied step we have, is the connection to our source file. In contrast to the population combined query, where we had the option to click onto the gear wheel symbol to see what query this query is based on, this is not available here in the case of the reference query. But if you look at the formula bar, again, if you can't see it, go to View and activate the formula bar. There you can see that the population combined query here is the source for our dim region table. We'll dive a bit deeper into this formula bar and how this M language works towards the end of the module, by the way. Nevertheless, I would like to show you the duplicate query also in a practical example here. So if you would have chosen duplicate instead, you could right click here and now select duplicate. This again takes a few seconds to load. That's totally normal. So we are done. I'm now in this duplicated query. And in the right part now in our applied steps, you see that we have copied the entire applied steps. This means we would now be able to delete the population combined query. In this case, it's not possible, as the dim region table, you can see it right here, depends on this query. But without the dim region table, we could now delete this initial population combined query, and we would still have the information stored in here. As I said, that's a complete copy of the initial query. We don't need that duplicate here, therefore we can simply press delete and get rid of this. So we have the dim region table now, the reference to our population combined query, but at the moment there is too much information in here. So let's work on that query in the next lecture.